everyone, and welcome. My name is Jamie Roughton, Associate Professor of Political Science at Greenville Tech. Today, Greenville Technical College's Speaker Series is immensely honored to host Dr. Akhil Amar as our Constitution Day presenter. Dr. Amar is the Sterling Professor of Law and Political Science at Yale University. Having joined the Yale faculty in 1985 at the age of 26, he is Yale's only currently active professor to have won the university's unofficial Triple Crown. That is the Sterling Chair for Scholarship, the Devane Medal for Teaching, and the Lamar Award for Alumni Service. Amar's works have won awards from both the American Bar Association and the Federalist Society, and he has been cited by the Supreme Court justices across the spectrum in more than 40 cases, which makes him the court's most cited legal scholar among contemporaries. He also served as a legal advisor on the television show The West Wing and has been featured on many news programs, including The Colbert Report and Fox News at Night. He is the author of more than 100 law review articles and several prize-winning books. Students in GTC's political science program are most familiar with Dr. Amar through his presentations on the Articles of the Constitution and through his participation in the PBS special Constitution USA with Peter Sagal. His latest and most ambitious work, The Words That Made Us, America's Constitutional Conversation, 1760 through 1840, has just been published, and his findings are the subject of the presentation today. This is the book that many of the students in attendance will be receiving as a gift from Dr. Amar and Greenville Tech. Thank you, Dr. Amar, for meeting with us today and allowing us the opportunity to hear more about your groundbreaking work. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Unfortunately, at this part in our presentation, there appears to have been a loss of connection where we did not hear the very beginning of Dr. Amar's presentation. However, we did record the majority. I will introduce the topic that Dr. Amar is speaking about in the coming part of the video, and then we will join him at the point where the recorder picked it back up. Dr. Amar discussed the importance of studying the Constitution and the research that he has done in his new book, The Words That Made Us. He discussed the importance of this as an American citizen, as a document that was put to a vote, that changed the course of history, that took a civilization where there were rulers and individuals who took power and gave it to a group of people who put it to a vote up and down the coast. He discussed the importance of citizens needing to learn about the history and the foundations and the premises of the Constitution. He wanted to highlight two specific parts that align with South Carolina's role in this process. One was the discussion of secession, whether the acceptance of the Constitution was considered an irrevocable acceptance, or if it aligned with the Civil War arguments that it could be, that a state could secede. So at this point in the discussion, he is reading from his book the original words of the framers as they are discussing the ratification and what is acceptable and what the understandings are of the union that they are creating. He will also discuss slavery. So I'm going to stop there and we will pick up with Dr. Amar reading from his text.
Madison, now back in New York. Now back in New York City, after his labors in Richmond, Virginia, emphasized that, quote, this is a quote, "The Constitution requires an adoption in toto and forever. It has been so adopted by the other states," unquote, including Madison's own Virginia. On July 24th, Hamilton read the letter aloud to the Poughkeepsie Convention, and then invoked the Article 6 Oath Clause of the Constitution, obliging every state and federal public servant to follow the supreme law of the Constitution itself. That oath, Hamilton explained, stands in the way, that's a quote, of any conditional ratification or purported reservation of a right of unilateral secession. Printers and the public across the continent were watching the Poughkeepsie Convention's climax with rapt attention. According to timely accounts published in more than a dozen newspapers circulating in every state, virtually every state, including notably Virginia and both Carolinas. Remember that, both Carolinas. Both Hamilton and his fellow delegate, John Jay, insisted that this is a quote, a reservation of a right to withdraw was inconsistent with the Constitution and was no ratification, unquote. Thus, the only compromise the Federalists offered in late July 1788 was, strictly speaking, an informal one. New York could ratify on the Massachusetts yes, but model, and anti-Federalist delegates could show their constituents all the amendment ideas that the convention had put into circulation and could further point out that many Federalist delegates had supported these ideas. The decisive showdown took place on July 26th. As that day dawned, no one knew for sure what the final vote count would be. Hamilton, Jay, Madison, and their allies had placed everything at risk, not just in New York, but as a practical matter more generally, by insisting that no secession right whatsoever could be recognized and that no other formal condition of any sort could be attached. Had the Federalists, by taking this strict position, impaled themselves? When the final tally was announced, the New York Federalists won by a single vote. Were the Federalists right in insisting that no state, having ratified, could unilaterally withdraw after the ninth state ratified the Constitution and the Constitution commenced operation? Abraham Lincoln thought so in 1861. Jefferson Davis thought otherwise. The question is ultimately a legal one. The Constitution is law. Indeed, it calls itself the supreme law of the land. Legally, either it permits unilateral secession or it prohibits unilateral secession, and by unilateral, I mean any given individual state on its own, or it's simply indeterminate. So who was right legally in the 1860s? And you remember who seceded unilaterally first? Y'all did, okay? So who was right legally in the 1860s? This is in italics in my book, page 262. Lincoln, by a wide margin. You need to understand this, my friends. This is about as clear a question as there is in American constitutional law, I say with every ounce of authority that I can muster. True, some of Lincoln's claims were not quite right, and he missed some of the best arguments for his conclusion. But the great constitutional conversation of 1787 to 1788 had not been indeterminate on this question, nor had the conversation supported a secession right. Nowhere, ever in the entire year of intense constitutional conversation did any leading Federalist try to woo skeptics and fence sitters by suggesting that a right of secession would exist and that if any state were dissatisfied, it could leave at will. Given how close the contest was in so many states, one vote in New York, surely if such a right had existed, Federalists would have emphasized it. It would have made anti-Federalists infinitely more willing to give the plan a trial run. Instead, the Federalists repeatedly said that the union they were proposing would be strict and indissoluble on the model of Scotland and England. In 1707, they created an indissoluble union. The indivisibility was central to the geostrategic argument for union, which I've explained in previous passages of the book. If any state at any time could take its land and waters and ally with some foreign European power, the Constitution's entire system, promising the permanent elimination of international borders from Georgia to Maine, would make no sense. Anti-Federalists in every key state grasped this point and loudly warned their fellow citizens that a state's decision to join would be irreversible. Everyone in 1787 to 1788 understood what the deal was. Indeed, at the risk of losing everything, and with all America and the world looking on, the Federalists in New York, at the end of the process, reaffirmed what had been clear from the beginning. Ratification would be, quote, in toto and forever, unquote. America's constitutional conversation did not begin in 1787. It was already in full swing in 1776. And the 1787 document must thus be understood as a continuation of a long conversation that Americans had been conducting among themselves. Understanding what the Constitution said requires understanding what the Constitution did not say. It did not call itself a confederation or a league or a treaty. These were pregnant omissions because all these words did prominently appear in the Articles of Confederation in describing USA 1.0. The Constitution did not say that states would remain sovereign. That too was a pointed omission, and every leading anti-federalist got the point. Now turn to what the document did say from start to finish. It called itself a constitution, in quotes, on the model of state constitutions that embodied Americans' deepest aspirations for self-government in 1776. It proudly promised a more perfect union, openly patterned on the indissoluble 1707 Union of Scotland and England, as Federalists emphasized at every turn in many states, in both speech and print, from the beginning to the end of the ratification process. It described itself as supreme law, that's in quotes, even over state constitutions. No state, this means you, South Carolina, no state, merely by purporting to modify its own constitution, could change the supreme legal status of the federal constitution. Only a proper federal amendment could change the federal constitution itself, and Article 5's amendment rules required the approval of many states, not just one. Article 5 also made clear that future amendments could indeed go into effect in all states, even if some states said no to these amendments. Article 5 thus decisively broke from the state sovereignty model of the Articles of Confederation, in which no state could be bound to any constitutional change absent its own consent. Article 7 took pre-existing state sovereignty seriously. Article 7 says the Constitution goes into effect among any 9 or more states that say yes, but only among those states. Rhode Island and North Carolina would not be bound unless they themselves agreed. And in 1788, these two jurisdictions, in fact, did not agree. So when George Washington takes the oath of office as first president, there are only 11 states in the new union. But once a sovereign state did agree to ratify the Constitution, and once 8 or more other sovereign states did the same, each merging state would no longer be fully sovereign post-merger. The federal Constitution would be the supreme law of the land. Everything would change because it had to change if America was to meet the geostrategic challenge posed by Britain, France, Spain, and the like. And that's what I've explained in previous chapters. Washington's letter, George Washington's letter to the Confederation Congress, a letter reprinted everywhere, often directly alongside the proposed constitutional text itself, minced no words in explaining what was happening and why. This is a quote. The independent sovereignty of each state would need to yield so that America could experience a consolidation of our union, in which is involved our prosperity, felicity, safety, perhaps our national existence, unquote. And if all that were not enough, the Constitution explicitly defined the post-ratification status of any American who took up arms against the United States for any reason, even if that American had the backing of persons claiming to represent his home state government. Any American who did that, said Article 3, would thereby be committing, quote, treason, unquote. Although many South Carolinians in 1861 would in fact commit treason, South Carolinians in 1788 surely understood what the Constitution said and meant. Indeed, on August 11th, 1788, Charleston's leading newspaper, the City Gazette, treated its readers to a detailed account of Hamilton and Jay's Poughkeepsie Convention speeches, rejecting a state's right to withdraw post-ratification, and the convention's subsequent decision to unconditionally take the Federalist take it or leave it deal. The Gazette flanked this dramatic account with a joyous cartoon, 11th Pillar, that's powerfully illustrated, because they're the 11th, New York was the 11th state to ratify, that powerfully illustrated Hamilton's and Jay's point. And let me show you, I'll do a share screen. I'll show you a picture of this. This is from Charleston's leading newspaper in 1788. Let's see if we can all see it together. And hold on here. Whoops, no, that's my parking permit for tomorrow. You're not interested in that. Here it is. 11th pillar. Do you see, whoops, do you see it there? It's 11 pillars with a dome on top and a Statue of Liberty blowing her trumpet. There's one empty pillar here on the left and one empty pillar there. That's going to be North Carolina that hasn't said yes, and Rhode Island that hasn't said yes. Okay, so you can all see this is the City Gazette, South Carolina's leading newspaper on August 11th, 1788. They know what the deal is. They're reporting just what's happened in Poughkeepsie. Okay. No pillar, once up, could be unilaterally removed lest the great federal dome, supported by and in turn supporting the ensemble of pillars, tumble to the ground, and with it, liberty itself, capping the grand federal edifice. Now, other newspapermen had arrayed their pillars chronologically by order of ratification, but the City Gazette, exquisitely attentive to dome-ish geometry, there's a dome, and sound architectural engineering, arranged its pillars geographically from south, left to north, right, a la Franklin's snake. This is stuff that you haven't seen, it's elsewhere in the book. The two pillars yet to be erected, as the cartoon elegantly illustrated, were geographically symmetric. The third most southerly, North Carolina, and the third most northerly, Rhode Island. I'll show you that picture again. See, this is North Carolina, the third most southerly. So this is Georgia, this is South Carolina. North Carolina has yet to say yes. Then Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and so on, all the way up to Rhode Island has yet to say yes. And above it is Massachusetts and New Hampshire. So the dome will work, but you can't just start pulling out pillars willy-nilly because otherwise the dome collapses and liberty falls to the ground. Okay, so that's my first excerpt, and it's all about secession. And it shows basically in a nutshell that South Carolina, that John C. Calhoun, a very famous South Carolinian, he was also a Yale, was basically all wet. And I think I give you the evidence. And I'll be straight with you. This is not a close question. It's incontrovertible. And if you think otherwise, you're a flat earther. Show me one person in that entire freaking year who said otherwise, or else please, yield. So I'm fierce, I'm honest with you all, I respect you, and I'm going to tell you what I really think. Now here's from the last chapter. This is a chapter called Adieus. My book is very dramatic. I have the characters, especially the big six of the American Revolution, first four presidents, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, along with Hamilton and Franklin. And in my last chapter, I kill them all off. I bring them back on stage, but in their death, there's a lot of significance. And I'm going to read you the section on Benjamin Franklin, because he's actually trying to tell us something. And South Carolina factors in here. This is going to be about slavery and not secession. And what you need to know is that the ancient world had slavery. Almost every society at every time in the world had some form of unfreedom. Americans didn't invent it. It didn't begin in 1619. So just like the rest of the until the Americans come along, there's really not strong democracy where you put the Constitution to a vote. Basically thugs everywhere, Kim Jong-un, Mao, Ho, Fidel, those type of people. That's who's running the world. And then Americans put the thing to a vote up and down the continent. Wow, good for us. And they weren't my ancestors, but I can claim them because I'm an American. And I hope all of you are too. Now, the ancient world had an idea of freeing slaves, but freeing individual slaves. The movie Ben-Hur, Charlton Heston gets freed. The comedy, a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum. The slave is trying to connive for his freedom, the Zero Mostel character. They had a concept, you read in the New Testament, the Old Testament, about the freeing of individual slaves. Here's what the ancient world didn't have. An idea of ending slavery everywhere. Abolition of slavery. That's an American idea. And the world's first abolition society forms in America in 1775, and its president is later going to be Ben Franklin. So that's what America gives the world, not slavery. So I don't believe in the 1619 Project. Okay, I don't think that slavery is America's sin, but it's not uniquely America's sin. The rest of the world had it. We start the process of ending it in the world, and we should be proud of that. But truthfully, South Carolina isn't quite part of it. It's actually the Yankees. It's basically north of the Mason-Dixon line, and I'll read you that story. So this is my last chapter, which I bring on all my great characters one by one chronologically: Franklin, Washington, Hamilton, Adams, Jefferson on the same day, and Madison, and kill them all off. I mean, God killed them, but I'm telling you the story. None of America's greatest founders composed a grand letter to his countrymen on his deathbed. Still, Americans searching for implicit farewell messages did not have far to look. Franklin went first. He died as he had lived, trying to better himself and the world. He was always tinkering, always inventing, always self-improving. He believed in progress, and he saw both himself and his country as works in progress. Some of his progressive ideas involved science and technology: the lightning rod, bifocals, the Franklin stove. Other progressive ideas were more social and political: a lending library, a volunteer fire company, a philosophical society, a non-sectarian university, the intercolonial Albany plan. In 1787, just days before the start of the Grand Federal Convention, Franklin accepted the presidency of the world's first notable abolition society. He had bought and owned slaves earlier in his life, doubtless influenced by his Quaker surroundings, but also moved by Enlightenment philosophy, common sense, and grand strategy. He eventually came to see that slavery was wrong, that it should end, and that America should lead the way. Knowing that death was near, he decided that within America, he himself should lead the way and make abolition his last great cause, his last gift to America and the world. As president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, Franklin signed a petition in early 1790 that reached Congress on February 12th, 1790. Exactly 19 years later, a magic number for Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln and Charles Darwin would be born on this day, a multiple coincidence about moral and scientific progress that surely would have delighted Franklin. So arguably the two greatest men of the entire 19th century, Lincoln and Darwin, are actually born on the same day, February 12th, 1809. That's interesting. Franklin's petition was direct and earnest. This was one side of Franklin. Paraphrasing the Declaration, on whose drafting committee Franklin had served, the petition proclaimed that, quote, mankind are all formed by the same almighty being and equally designed for the enjoyment of happiness. Equal liberty was originally the portion and is still the birthright of all men, unquote. From these basic premises flowed the petition's conclusion and prayer for relief. Congress should, quote, remove this inconsistency from the character of the American people and step to the very verge of the power vested in you for discouraging every species of traffic in the persons of our fellow men, unquote. Congressmen from the deep South raged at the very idea of discussing slavery. A couple of Quaker anti-slave slave trade petitions had reached Congress on February 11th. Now that Franklin's great name was directly involved and American slavery itself, as distinct from the African slave trade, was apparently being drawn into question, the stakes shot up. Seconds after Franklin's petition was read aloud on the House floor, the House of Representatives, South Carolina Representative Thomas Tudor Tucker leaped to his feet. Quote, do these men expect a general emancipation of slaves by law? This would never be submitted to by the Southern states without a civil war, unquote. This is February 1790, and he's saying civil war. In July 1776, it will be recalled, South Carolina's Continental Congressman Thomas Lynch Jr. had made a similar statement, quote, "If it's debated whether slaves are our property, there's an end to the Confederation," unquote. Tucker displayed remarkable confidence in his own superiority as a constitutionalist compared to the mere likes of Benjamin Franklin. The condescending South Carolinian, quote, was surprised to see a memorial on the subject of slavery and abolition, signed by a man who ought to have known the Constitution better, unquote. Other representatives joined the fray. Georgia's James Jackson and Abraham Baldwin, and South Carolina's Edanis Burks and William Lawton Smith proclaimed the petition's substance anti-constitutional because Congress had no power to do anything whatsoever until 1808. Even to seriously consider the petition would be, in their words, unconstitutional. Many other House members countered correctly. See, what they said is wrong. Countered correctly that the 1808 clause governed only the early abolition of the international slave trade, and the Congress surely had power to consider a wide range of other measures that might tend to lessen or ameliorate slavery. In 1789, Congress had in fact briefly considered imposing a $10 head tax on each imported slave, as pointedly allowed by the 1808 clause itself, and had in fact prohibited slavery in the Northwest Territory. Even more fundamentally, many on the floor and in the gallery were disturbed to hear some members insist that mere discussion of an important issue was itself unconstitutional. Even if Congress lacked power to act immediately, which was not true, surely Congress could also consider amending the Constitution to give itself the power. But how could it do this without discussing the matter? Also, what were anti-slavery folk to make of Jackson's claim that locals would likely kill any future Georgia federal judge who tried to promote emancipation? As we look back at this 1790 debate, a great deal is blindingly clear in hindsight. Unfreedom for Southern Black slaves threatened freedom of speech for white citizens everywhere from the very beginning. And South Carolina and Georgia in particular were always dangerously extreme. As debate continued on February 12th, 1790, growing ever angrier, Madison became alarmed that things had taken a serious turn. The very debate about the debate was ill-serving the Deep South's cause, but South Carolinians had no sense of prudence or of their audience. In the process of repeatedly insisting with much fist pounding that the issue could not be discussed, they were discussing the issue openly and with the Manhattan press watching from the galleries agog. The Southern extremists, some of whom had never been up north before 1789, were also precipitating strong and polarizing pushback as action prompted reaction. The open debate was discomfiting men like Madison, Upper South slaveholders who, unlike the South Carolinians, were ashamed of slavery and agreed in principle with Franklin, but hesitated to do much about it. So Madison urged the House to refer the petition to a special committee so that things could calm down. They didn't. When the committee rendered its report in mid-March 1790, trying to delineate what Congress could and could not do, several days of open floor debate ensued. Georgians and South Carolinians once again insisted that even consideration and discussion of the report was, unquote, unconstitutional, intending to injure some of the states in the Union, unquote. When this extremist gambit failed, Georgia's Representative Jackson returned to center stage to defend American slavery with a flurry of arguments. America's economic development required slave labor, he said, and Blacks were suited for the work that needed doing in climates that were unhealthy for whites. If America refrained from using slaves in such land, Spain would fill the vacuum and in a short period dominate various lucrative markets. It was immensely preferable to be a slave in America than to remain in Africa, said Jackson. Once freed, Blacks would be unable to intermingle and intermarry with most whites, would not want to associate with them or help to create a motley breed of mixed race offspring. Sending Blacks to Africa was impracticable. Custom and habit deserved respect. The Bible blessed slavery. These are all Jackson's arguments. Franklin, remember him, Ben Franklin, countered with a lovely satire in the press. This was another side of Franklin. This would turn out to be his very last journalistic piece, and it poetically recalled his very first journalistic hoax when, as a teenager, he had puckishly posed as a middle-aged matron, Silence Dogood. Some of you will remember that movie with Nicolas Cage, a national treasure. Franklin likewise published his 1790 parody under a pen name, but no one who knew him could miss his signature style and sly wit. The piece pretended to be an earnest letter to the editor telling readers about a 1687 debate among Algerian Muslims concerning their customary practice of enslaving European Christians. Here's the spoof. Reading last night in your excellent paper the speech of Mr. Jackson in Congress against their meddling in the affair of slavery or attempting to mend the condition of slaves, it put me in mind a similar one made 100 years ago by Sidi Ibrahim, a member of the Diwan of Algiers. It was against granting the petition of the sect called Erika, or purists, who prayed for the abolition of piracy and slavery as being unjust. Mr. Jackson does not quote it in his eloquent speech, despite its surprising similarity. The African's speech, as translated, is as follows. Have these Erika considered the consequences of granting their petition? If we cease our piratic cruises against the Christians, how shall we be furnished with the commodities which are so necessary for us? If we forbear to make slaves of their people, who in this hot climate are to cultivate our lands? Must we not then be our own slaves? And is there not more compassion and more favor due to us as Muslims than to them as Christian dogs? And if we set our slaves free, what is to be done with them? Few of them will return to their countries. They know too well the great hardships they must be subject to. They will not embrace our holy religion. They will not adopt our manners. Our peoples will not pollute themselves by intermarrying with them. And what is there so pitiable in their present condition? Were they not slaves in their own countries? Is their condition then made worse by falling into our hands? No. Here they're brought into a land where the sun of Islamism shines forth its light and shines in full splendor, and they have an opportunity of making themselves acquainted with the true religious doctrine and thereby saving their immortal souls. How grossly are they, the petitioners, mistaken in imagining slavery to be disallowed by Quran? Are there not two precepts, to quote no more, are not the two precepts, to quote no more, quote, masters, treat your slaves with kindness. Slaves, serve your masters with cheerfulness and fidelity. Clear proofs to the contrary. Of course, Franklin's tongue-in-cheek, topsy-turvy, reversed everything, a classic satirical move. In his alternative universe, dark-skinned Africans who deemed themselves racially superior and culturally superior were enslaving light-skinned European folk. Christians were the slaves, not the masters. The Erika, the phonetic ending syllables of America, were an almost anagram of the Quakers. Erika spelled E-R-I-K-A. The scriptural passages came not, as claimed, from the Quran. Rather, they were the very biblical texts that Jackson himself had quoted. So this is a total tongue-in-cheek satire. Franklin's spoof ran in the March 25th, 1790 issue of Philadelphia's Federal Gazette. Less than a month later, he was dead at age 84, and his countrymen began to see, with hindsight, the special significance of the words that he likely knew were his last. His playful piece was also deadly serious. They were his dying words to America. By pretending to excavate the past, Franklin's farewell message was in fact inviting his fellow Americans to envision the future. How would the Constitution Project appear to posterity in 1887, 100 years after the Grand Philadelphia Convention? If America as a whole did not change course and move toward abolition, as his own Pennsylvania had already done in 1780, would the nation's continuing embrace of slavery and its hodgepodge of Jacksonian rationalizations one day come to seem every bit as twisted and despotic as Franklin's fictional Algerians of 1687. Okay, so that's, I think, enough to give you a little bit of a taste of the book. It's a long book, lots of passages, but I picked passages about slavery and secession for obvious reasons, because they connect especially to the history of South Carolina.
All right, Dr. Amar, we had some questions that we had discussed that students have sent in. So I'm gonna go through some of these.
Go through all of them if you can. I'm delighted that the students asked me questions, and we'll try to do a lightning round, and I'll give you my candid answers.
All right. So this question comes from Bryce. He says, I've always wondered if leaving the Constitution purposely ambiguous was the right thing to do. So I have one question. Do you think that was the best course of action for our framers to take?
So some things are ambiguous, I agree. Oh, but a lot of things are pretty clear. And by the way, I'll let you write all the words in the Constitution if you let me write all the numbers. Okay, so it's pretty clear. There are 2 senators per state, and I'm from California, and there's 70 times more Californians than there are Wyomingans. But 2 means 2, and that's not ambiguous, and that matters today in the U.S. Senate. The House of Representatives is apportioned in a certain way, because I don't think it's so ambiguous about how many seats each state gets. And at the founding, no longer today, one of the really big rules was 3/5. Slave states got extra credit for their slaves. And that was a factor not just of the House of Representatives, but of the Electoral College. Without that extra 3/5, actually, John Adams beats Thomas Jefferson in 1800. 13 electoral votes went to the South because of slavery. Adams lost by about 8. He would have won by 5 rather than losing by 8 if there hadn't been the 3/5 clause. So, not all the Constitution is ambiguous. Some things were, other things weren't.
Okay. So the next question comes from Samuel. It says, given today's political climate, how difficult has it become to explain the principles and language of the Constitution to a people around the U.S. and even the world? Additionally, has the Constitution's meaning been distorted to accommodate politicians' political agendas and ideas to justify policymaking? And he says, thank you, Dr. Amar.
Sure, people will bend the Constitution, they'll twist it and turn it into something unrecognizable if you let them. So that's why the Constitution is short, so you can read it and reread it and reread it. Remember, it came to a vote by ordinary citizens. And okay, I'll be honest with you, if you read it today, you won't understand its full background. So that's why I'm trying to write books for a general audience. They are not ideological. I don't tell you what my political views are, but cards on the table, this may come up. I personally don't have a gun in my home for self-protection, but I think you have a right to have one in yours, because I think it's actually in our Constitution's traditions and amendments, less so the 2nd, in fact, than the 14th, and we'll talk about that. I'm a Democrat, and I think Citizens United is rightly decided, and we can talk about that. I'm personally skeptical about the death penalty, but I think in a lot of situations it's fully constitutional. I am personally pro-choice, but Roe versus Wade is not a well-reasoned decision. So I'm going to tell you not what my personal views are, but what I think the Constitution actually honestly really does mean. And I'm grateful that Jamie reminded you that I'm cited by justices across the political spectrum, and that folks on the Federalist Society try to take my ideas seriously. They're on the right, and folks in the American Bar Association, they're more on the left, take my ideas seriously. So I'm going to try to write books and articles for fellow citizens so that you have to read the Constitution for yourself, and then I'm going to give you the history, the backdrop of all of that. Because if you don't know what it means, the politicians on both sides of the aisle will actually twist it and fold it and spindle it and mutilate it, and the justices actually don't always get things right, and you won't be in a position to hold them accountable unless you know what's in it. And let me say it a different way. Because you say, well, that takes a lot of time. Yeah, it takes some time. I promise you, almost everyone listening today knows more about baseball and football than you know about the Constitution. Okay, so if I met you on the street, and I probably could have an intelligent conversation with more than half of you about Derek Jeter and the recent Hall of Fame and inductees, and we could talk about the steroids era and how do we think about bonds or not, and how do we think about comparing Babe Ruth to Willie Mays and their different eras. And more than half of you would actually be able to talk to me about that, or how Tom Brady compares to, and then pick, your favorite, whether it's Joe Montana or Peyton Manning or John Elway or Bart Starr or whatever. Okay, so we can talk about a grand slam in tennis and Djokovic, and you know what I'm talking about. Okay, but most of you don't know the history of your Constitution and what it means, and if you don't, we die as a people. So you have to know it, and then the politicians and the judges will be less able to make stuff up because you'll know more about the document. But fair warning, if you do study the document, I want you to be like me and not just read your own political preferences into the thing, but actually be open to learning from the thing, what it really does say and doesn't say. It will change you in the process, but it will give us as Americans more in common. So what we should have in common today needs to be more culturally than just baseball. By the way, we root for different teams in baseball. That doesn't fully pull us together. I'm a Red Sox fan. My son is a Yankees fan, at least sometimes. So that's not what unifies us, but we can both be, we can all be Americans together, but we need to know the Constitution. And that's why we have events like this, like Constitution Day, to commemorate this. Just like if you're Jewish, every year there's, and by the way, to those of you out there who might be Jewish, Happy New Year, Shana Tova, and Yom Kippur is coming up. But every year at Passover, Jews around the world gather to remember who they were, who they are, where they were, where they're going, what happened, thousands of years ago that has meaning today. And I think we Americans should do that, not just every July 4th, not just every Memorial Day, not just every Flag Day, not just but on every Thanksgiving, but also every Constitution Week, which is Constitution Day is September 17th. And this event is part of a Constitution Week so that we can actually remember the American story.
All right. So the next one would be from Megan. And it says, what did the founding fathers mean by the pursuit of happiness?
And the truth is, I'm not entirely sure. That's in the Declaration of Independence, not the Constitution. In the language that I read to you from Franklin, he uses that word happiness. Here are 2 or 3 things that I can tell you. One, that a standard phrase from John Locke, who was read by Thomas Jefferson and others and did provide the backdrop for certain aspects of the Declaration of Independence, a right of revolution when government is acting tyrannically, talked about life, liberty, or property. And many state constitutions talk about life, liberty, or property. And so sometimes you need to pay attention not just to what the words are, but what the words aren't. So they chose life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness rather than life, liberty, or property. Second, some people would remind you that there's not a guarantee of achieving happiness, only a right to pursue it. And that's kind of an opportunity and not an absolute guarantee. I can further tell you that some ideas about pursuing happiness have some connections to Scottish Enlightenment theory. And if you're interested in that, you might want to read a great book by one of my friends, one of the people who I hold up as a role model, Gary Wills. He's written many books, a great book called Lincoln at Gettysburg. He wrote a book about the Federalist Papers called Explain America. But he also wrote a book about the Declaration of Independence, in which that phrase appears, called Inventing America. And he talks about how Jefferson was influenced by Scottish Enlightenment thought. And he has some observations about that phrase, pursuit of happiness. So that's a slight punt on my part. I have focused on that phrase less than on other things in the Constitution.
Okay. So Jessica asked, do you believe our constitutional rights are being challenged, overlooked in today's society, as well as by today's government officials? If so, can you explain how you believe they are? And if not, can you explain that as well?
Well, I do think that in general, courts are more rights protective today than they have been for much of American history. It's the First Amendment says Congress shouldn't be able to mess with speech, meaning political expression. I think at its core, it pretty clearly means that the government shouldn't be able to punish you for criticizing the government. And yet, that's what John Adams did in the Sedition Act of 1798, and the judges cheerfully enforced that. And that's what Woodrow Wilson did in the 20th century, and courts cheerfully enforced that. And I just want to remind you that John Adams was a Harvard man and Woodrow Wilson was a Princeton person. So just remember, you can't blame Yale for that one. But South Carolina and North Carolina, they make it a crime to criticize slavery. It's a capital offense. This is not exaggeration. It is a death penalty offense to criticize slavery, even in the pulpit in North Carolina. Now it says Congress shall make no law, but how can a constitution work if government can make it a crime to criticize incumbents or government policy? And you heard the South Carolinians saying even to talk about slavery, is unconstitutional. They were saying that's wrong. Okay, so today 9-0 on the Supreme Court. That's wrong. Conservatives would say that's wrong. Liberals would say that's wrong. Conservatives might believe in. So the First Amendment has more friends than ever before. On the right, that's Citizens United. And if you ask me, I'll defend Citizens United on its facts. That might be unpopular with some folks, but on its facts, it's, in my view, rightly decided. I'm a Democrat who agrees with the Republicans on the court. And on the left, the court has said people can burn a flag disrespectfully and not be punished. And I'm with them. And so was conservative like Antonin Scalia. He was with the majority in that case. And so was a conservative appointed by Ronald Reagan, my dear friend, Anthony Kennedy, whom I quite adore. So today, I would say the First Amendment, it has more friends, liberal and conservative, than ever before. The flag burning case and Citizens United case. Courts today do say there is a right to have a gun in your home for self-protection. They didn't say that for much of American history. When I first started writing about this, and I wrote a long time ago, "Ooh, you have a right to have a gun in your home for self-protection." I don't have one. They scare me. This is not what this is not about my political views. It's about what I actually think our Constitution really says, and not just the Second Amendment, but the later 14th Amendment. There are unenumerated rights. We're going to talk about all these things, I'm sure, in the questions to come. I've had a sneak peek at the questions. Jamie was kind enough to share them with me in advance, so I've thought about them a bit. But I would say First Amendment, Second Amendment, courts today are more protective of rights in general than courts have historically been for much of American history. When John Adams made it a crime to criticize John Adams, the courts unanimously and enthusiastically enforced that law, put people in prison for months for criticizing John Adams, put Eugene Victor Debs in prison in a unanimous Supreme Court case, sentenced him to 10 years in a federal penitentiary for merely giving an anti-war speech, a kind of a speech of the sort that George McGovern would give about Vietnam, or Bernie Sanders would give about Iraq and Afghanistan, or something like that. So I would say in general, courts are more protective of rights than they have been. And there are unenumerated rights in the Constitution. And how do you find them? How do you think about them? Oh, I've written about that. That's chapter 3 of my book, America's Unwritten Constitution. And it's written for my fellow citizens, you see, how to think about unenumerated rights. We have never less rights than the Constitution provides, but more. But how we find them, how you go about finding them, there are implicit rules for that, I believe. And I'll share them with you and try to share them with you in my books. And they don't always lead to liberal results. They don't always lead to conservative results. Suppose there weren't a Second Amendment at all. But there are unenumerated rights. So here's what I would say. Liberals believe in the right to have sex in the home. It's called Griswold versus Connecticut. Government can't prohibit contraception. Conservatives believe you have a right to have guns in the home. I say, this is America, give them both what they want. You'll remember it this way. I say, personally, I prefer sex, but whatever floats your boat. Okay, now you'll remember it. But if liberals can play the unenumerated rights game in cases like Griswold versus Connecticut, I think conservatives can too, even if there weren't a Second Amendment. A right to have a gun in your home for self-protection is in almost every state constitution, and state constitutions are an important source of unenumerated rights in America. And again, I don't have one in mind, so this is not personally my preferences, but this is America, and in America, actually, doesn't say in the Constitution that you have a right to have a pet dog. It doesn't. Oh, but this is America, and the day they come for my pet dog without good reason, that's the day I get me a gun. Okay, and so there are American traditions that generate strong unenumerated rights, and courts protect unenumerated rights and enumerated rights, I would say, more vigorously today, left and right, than has been true for much of American history.
Okay, thank you. So I think you addressed these two kind of, but I'll combine them and kind of pose that to you if you want to add anything to it. But Anthony and Simi, they asked about the framers and what were the major issues that prevented the major contributors to the Constitution from addressing slavery and women's rights at the time.
Okay,
so
great.
Obviously, yeah.
Perfect. So on slavery, I didn't read you all the passages, but basically, you got to keep the South on board, because you have to create a geostrategic union that we all have to hang together. And in order to do that, you have to make concessions to the Deep South, which needs slavery to work the land, or that's what it believes. So there are compromises made. I think 3/5 is one of those compromises. I think a better compromise would have been 3/5, now heck 5/5, but 1/5 in 1808 and 0/5 in 1828. We can haggle about the numbers, but I think it would have been better if they put the 3/5 clause, and slavery in the West and fugitive slaves, all these pro-slavery features of the Constitution that were necessary to get the South Carolinians on board. If they put those all on a sunset track so that they'd phase out. That would have been a better way of doing it. And the South Carolinians would not have been happy because they're extreme on this. But the Virginians would have gone for it. And if the Virginians go for it, the North Carolinians at the end of the day would have gone with the Virginians, and South Carolina would have had no choice. In today's world, Kim Jong-un is a crazy man, and you're never going to persuade him, but you can persuade the Chinese. Back then, actually, the South Carolinians were crazy men. You weren't going to persuade them, but you could persuade the Virginians, and you could have put slavery on a path of gradual extinction. That's what Pennsylvania does. That's what other northern states are doing. That was the missed opportunity. But you're going to have to make some compromises with slavery, because you need to get South Carolina and Georgia in particular on board, and even Virginia and North Carolina. But I think there were better ways of doing it than what they did. Now that was on slavery, and I'm being straight with you. And I talk about this in great detail in the book. On women's rights, here's the key. And I have a whole section talking about the conversation between Abigail Adams and John Adams, the famous letter, Remember the Ladies. Women are not asking for the vote in 1776 or 1787. None of them are. They will later start demanding the vote in places like Seneca Falls. In volume 2, this book takes you only up to 1840. Volume 2 is the words that made us equal. And that's from 1840 to 1920. And women will start beating the drum for suffrage, but not in the early period. So there, and that's why you need to know your history. You need to know what was imaginable and what wasn't. You call it, if you want to use a fancy phrase, what was in the Overton window of political possibility. And women's suffrage really wasn't being discussed at the time. Abigail Adams, you know what she's asking for when she says, remember the ladies? She's not asking for women voting. If you read it in detail, and I have a discussion of this, she wants in America the rules to be such that husbands don't have a legal right to beat and rape their wives, which they did have a legal right to do under the common law, to exercise what was called a right of moderate chastisement, and to demand sexual access, because the idea was the woman consented once at the altar, and that was once and forever, and it could never withdraw it temporarily. But we don't believe that today. Abigail Adams didn't think that husbands should have a right to abuse their wives. She was asking that in the new revolutionary America, marriage laws be revised to restrict cruelty to women, to wives in particular.
Yeah. And even at the Seneca Falls Convention, that was one of the big debates. Many women thought that it was too aggressive.
Radical.
As for
Yes.
voting. Yes,
Yep.
it's hard to get something when a good portion of your population doesn't want it as well.
So let's talk candidly, because I know someone's going to go there, and I'll go there first. Let's talk about Roe versus Wade. If you're a pro-choice person, and you make a constitutional argument just merely women's equality, oh, how do you deal with the fact that there are many pro-life women? There are many women who don't share your view on that, and you have to take that seriously, which some of my friends on the left don't quite. I personally, cards on the table, happen to be pro-choice, but I understand that there are many people of good faith, men and women, who have a different view of this, and so you can't just say, well, it's a women's rights issue, because women are pretty deeply divided on that issue even today. So it's complicated. You didn't think you were going to hear that from a Connecticut Yankee, did you? But I get it.
Yeah, it is difficult sometimes. There are many divisions across even similar groups. So the next question comes from Sarah and Chidumbum, and they are, why should every American inform themselves on the historical importance and contents of the Constitution? And I think you've pretty much addressed that, but if there's anything else that you want to say.
I was setting up, I saw that question and I was setting it up because I gave half the answer, but not the other half. Yes. Because if you don't, we all die. Yeah. The world dies, America dies, and we are actually the last best hope of Earth. And if we can't make democracy work multiculturally, then what chance is there for the world? And every 4 years, damn it, you have to show up to vote, and you're the hiring committee. You're picking the next president of the United States, and his or her first task is to swear an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. You need to know what that Constitution is in order to figure out what the job description is. That's your job. Every 4 years, I think every 2 years, you have to show up to vote for members of Congress. You're the drafting committee. You can't do your job unless you know actually what the job is. So if you were drafting for the Buccaneers, or the Falcons or whatever, you would say, we need a quarterback. You would know what a quarterback does, and who are the good quarterbacks and who are the not so good quarterbacks. You can't draft unless you know actually, what the job is. You can't do your job as a citizen unless you understand the Constitution. And if you don't do it, not to be melodramatic, but the world dies. Okay, people died for this document, and most of you, not the people here today, because you could be doing other things, but many Americans can't be bothered, and they can do other stuff. And I get it. Some of the stuff that they do is really important to spend time with your church. I get it. I try to spend time on spiritual things and to be involved in Little League, or to volunteer, you've got a job to do, and that takes a lot of time. I get it. All I'm asking is that you spend as much time and give as much energy to the Constitution as you do to your favorite sport, which today most Americans don't. And that you understand. So I could go out there and have a really elaborate discussion with someone about the infield fly rule, or Billy, what happened, what happened when that baseball trickled through Billy Buckner's legs or whatever, or how much the Astros cheated or didn't, or Deflategate. I mean, but I can't have an intelligent conversation with most people about most of the things in the Constitution, like whether the Presidential Succession Act is constitutional. I think it actually isn't. And if we ever are in a crisis where the president, the vice president are out of commission, we could have an absolute constitutional disaster because we haven't gotten the rules clear in advance, which we should. And this is not a partisan thing. I think if you vote for Trump and Pence, you should never end up with Nancy Pelosi. If something happened to Trump and Pence. And if you vote for Obama and Clinton, Obama and Biden, you should never end up with Newt Gingrich, and if you vote for Biden and Harris, you should never end up with Kevin McCarthy, which you could in a year unless we change the statute, you see. And I tried to be nonpartisan about the thing. If you vote for Reagan and George H.W. Bush, you shouldn't end up with Tip O'Neill.
Yeah.
So this is a disaster waiting to happen.
Okay. Yeah. So the next question, there's 3 questions. They're pretty similar, so I'm going to condense them into one. And they're from Jamir, Skylar, and Megan. And it says, do you support changes and amendments to the Constitution regarding the advancement of policy, ethics, weapons, technologies, and other innovations and ideologies that were not yet conceivable or practiced? Why or why not?
So I do think that the Constitution has been amended and will continue to be amended. I think most of the amendments have actually improved the document. They've made amends for some of the sins and the lapses of the founding fathers. And you heard me say some pretty nice things about them in my post, but they weren't perfect because they didn't put slavery on a path of gradual extinction. We had to fight a civil war in which more than 500,000 people died. And so they blew it on that, truthfully. And there was an alternative. They could have actually had the sliding scale, gradual elimination of slavery. And the South Carolinians wouldn't have loved it, but the Virginians would have been okay with it. The North Carolinians would have gone on, along with it. And the South Carolinians would have to say, okay, we can't go it alone. So grumblingly, they would have fallen in line. And the Georgians were going to go along with it because they would have folded like cheap deck chairs because they need the Union Army to protect them against Indians. So the South Carolinians would have been the holdouts. They would have been the crazy people. But at the end of the day, they don't want to actually have to confront George Washington, who can be a pretty stern fellow, let me tell you. So yes. Why should I think that all the good ideas have been thought about, all the sensible amendments have been adopted? I don't think that. What will be the amendments of the future? What should be the amendments of the future? Oh, that's the subject of chapter 12, my final chapter of a book called America's Unwritten Constitution, in which I tell you what will, I believe, as a prediction, be some of the amendments of the future and what should be. And here are my 3 rules. They're both prescriptive and predictive. And you'll see, once again, they're not about what I'm not Julie Andrews singing about my favorite things, okay? I'm trying to say, this is what America looks like to me. Here are the 3 rules. Because you need 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, 3/4 of the states, that's gonna be very hard to do unless both parties buy in. You need both parties to agree to something. 2, our amendments in the past in general have added to liberty and equality. They haven't taken away from liberty and equality. So the amendments of the future should do that as well. One amendment didn't, prohibition, and it didn't work so well. And 3, most of the things in the Constitution, the federal Constitution, states did first. This is a Brandeisian idea about states as laboratories. States can road test all sorts of really interesting experiments. States had a written constitution first. They put constitution to a vote first in Massachusetts and then in New Hampshire. They had bicameral legislatures before the federal constitution did, and independent judiciaries and bills of rights. Some states got rid of slavery first. Some states let women vote first. So states did things first and will continue to do that. You want to see the federal constitution of the future, look at state constitutions of today. So those are my 3 prescriptions and predictions. State constitutions, both parties need to buy in, and we should add to liberty and equality rather than undercut liberty and equality. Oh, but actually you might think, well, those are don't have much bite. Oh, yes, they do. I'm saying in my lifetime, I'm glad that George W. Bush failed when he tried to get a constitutional amendment through that said flag burning should be criminal, because that would have restricted freedom of speech. I'm glad that he failed, and I like him personally. I mean, one of my research assistants actually was his best and favorite speechwriter, Chris Michel. We have lots in common, but I'm glad that he failed, his coalition, when it said 20 years ago, less than 20 years ago, there should be an amendment to the Constitution that says marriage is one man and one woman only, which would have restricted liberty and equality. And I'm glad that didn't get put in the Constitution. You see, there was majority support for it at a certain point. I don't think there's even majority support for it probably in America today, if you polled America today. Maybe in South Carolina, there might be a majority for such an amendment, but I think nationally there probably wouldn't today. And that's because most of the students, actually, even conservative students, have different ideas about human sexuality than their grandparents do. And this is a political science point. Their grandparents are going to die first. And they're not going to change their mind about human sexuality as they age. They're going to change their mind about other things. They're going to become more conservative on certain things. They're going to not like taxes so much and believe in property a little bit more as they age. But I don't think they'll change their minds on the idea that some people are, to borrow from Gaga, are born this way and shouldn't be deprived the pursuit of happiness. And there's no guarantee, of happiness when you get married. Let me tell you, since this, I'm thinking about this a bit this month. We just celebrated our 32nd wedding anniversary a week ago, and that was our right to pursue happiness. No guarantee. But we were allowed to do that, even though we happen not to be white. There have probably been times in the world where people haven't been allowed to marry the person they wanted. Blacks weren't allowed to marry whites and whites blacks. In my lifetime, Loving versus Virginia changed that. In my lifetime, 20 years ago, no two men could get married. No two women could get married. Now, in every state in the union, 2 men and 2 women can marry each other, and that might be one way of thinking about a pursuit of happiness. And there are no guarantees.
Yeah, definitely. All right. In what way? So we talked a little bit about influence on the Constitution. I mean, from the Constitution. But in what ways did the U.S. Constitution influence and contribute to constitutions of other countries?
I did talk about this just a little bit. So before 1787, there's almost no democracy in the planet. There's Britain. In 1706, there's Britain, Switzerland, and Britain has a king no one voted for at the time, and a parliament no American voted for. But for Britain itself, they've got a king, but no Britain ever voted for the king. They've got a House of Lords that no Britain ever voted for. Only maybe 1 in 7 or 1 in 10 whites is eligible to vote. Men is eligible to vote. In order to but they have some democracy. They have elections plus or minus and jury trial, so a little bit. You got Switzerland that's somewhat self-governing, but no one lives in Switzerland. They have more sheep and goats than human beings. And the Dutch are in the process of losing their democracy, and that's it on planet Earth, apart from America in 1786. That's it. Yeah. And then and there were ancient democracies, but they flickered out. Pre-imperial Rome, ancient Athens under the Cleisthenes Periclean Constitution, but they flickered out. They couldn't make a go of it. Okay, so the history of the world, the history of thugs. And then the people of the United States, in this year that changed everything, that we commemorate today, or this month, September, because in September 1787, that's when they put the thing to a vote. And they weren't my ancestors, but I can affiliate with them, put the thing to a vote up and down the continent. And the world would never be the same. I think this is the Big Bang, the hinge of human history. And today, half the world by population and landmass governs themselves. And I think it's because of the success of the US Constitution. France is a great republic today. I don't think it's as impressive as California, frankly, but it's not bad. I think California treats its minorities better than the French treat their Algerians, the Muslim population. But France isn't bad. Again, French would be totally offended when I say it in that way too, because they think their counterpart is the United States and they're better than the US. You're going to ask me about the French Declaration of Rights, and I'm going to tell you that the French Revolution ends in a bloodbath. Okay, but France's counterpart is not the United States of America; it's California. They don't like to hear it, but it's California, and California. So, but at the time, the Constitution is absolutist monarchy. And there's no, and today Germany is an amazing, republic. I'm a big admirer of Merkel. And back then, basically, it's run by emperors and dukes and just unelected aristocrats and monarchs. And today, Central Europe is struggling, but there are elections in Poland and the former Czech Republic and Ukraine and other places. And wow, and Japan governs itself. 1 billion people with a B govern themselves in India. It's not perfect. It's not perfect in the US with free and fair elections, plus or minus, written constitution, multiple political parties alternating in power, fair amount of religious freedom, a Bill of Rights enforced by judges. My parents are still alive. They were born in India. When they were alive, a king from halfway across the world was telling them what to do, and a parliament from halfway across the world that none of them voted for was telling them what to do, just like the American colonists, and now they govern themselves. And that's because of, in my view, the legal, political, military, social, cultural, and economic success of the United States constitutional project. And we Americans shouldn't forget that. I want you to see the mistakes we've made. I'm not going to let you forget slavery. I won't, because I want to be honest, but I also want you to see the greatness of America, because I see it. And in America today, some people are only taught the great parts, and other people are only taught the bad parts. And that's a problem. So I'm trying to write a book in which I tell you both sides, and I'm facts driven.
Okay. Accuracy over partisanship. So I'm going to go ahead and jump to Dr. Sasser's question, since you kind of touched on it already, and then we'll go back up. But Dr. Sasser had asked about comparing and contrasting the French Declaration of the Rights of Man with the Bill of Rights in the U.S. Constitution. And he's more broadly interested on how the events of the French Revolution and the framing and ratification of the Constitution might have influenced one another. So
the French are copying the Americans, and the Americans are intensely proud of this, and that's why Jefferson forms a pro-French party. It will become the modern Democratic Party, and the Americans are flattered that the French are taking them seriously. There are 10 Frenchmen for every American. We forget. We think like we won at Yorktown. At Yorktown, there were 2 French military people on land and sea than for every American. Okay, so there are 3 million white Americans and 30 million Frenchmen. Okay, so we're just little pipsqueaks on the corner of the civilized world, and they're one of the 2 great powers of the world, along with Britain. So, but that, and they're copying us. That's impressive. That said, their revolution fails. It ends with Napoleon and then a restoration of the monarchy. And in between, it's a bloodbath. I'm not a fan of the French Revolution. Hundreds of thousands of people die. The guillotine, is mass terror on a horrific scale. It is going to actually be a precursor of the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution, in which millions of people perish. To quote the Rolling Stones, killed the Tsar and his ministers, Anastasia screamed in pain. That's the song called Sympathy for the Devil. Mao, the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, these were horrific, savage outpourings of blood and butchery, Pol Pot, and they were inspired by the French Revolution to some extent, you see. I think our revolution largely succeeded. It generated a constitution in which the losers actually acquiesced. Their big idea, Bill of Rights, was taken on board. Their big leaders actually aren't voted off the island, become presidents of the United States. People who oppose the Constitution, James Monroe, Vice President of the United States, Elbridge Gerry, George Clinton. I think our project succeeds. So the professor who asked that, you told me, was a philosophy professor, and philosophy professors look at the words often, and the words are inspiring. But I'm a historian and political scientist and a law person. I want you to say, go beyond the words, look at actually, the regime. Did it stabilize itself? Did it actually produce all the good things that were promised? Because if you look at a Chinese constitution today, I'm sure it has all sorts of nice things in it, or the Russian constitution, it's just not worth the paper they're printed on because they have a bad structure of government. And so why did America succeed? Because Americans were practicing self-government at a local level with juries and assemblies for 150 years before the American Revolution. And the French had no traditions of actual self-government. And so when the French Revolution came along, they actually didn't know how to do things. And Americans, and slavery was horrible, and it leads to a civil war, and I tell that story as well. But I would still say our revolution was much more successful than the French. So on that, I'm with Burke and Hamilton.
Okay.
And here's the interesting thing about Burke and Hamilton. They are both in favor of the American Revolution and opposed to the French Revolution. So they're traditionalists. They're just opposed to all change, okay? The Tories of the world. And then they're the radicals like Jefferson, therefore the Bernie Sanders, the AOC, I think she's clueless, crowd. They're just for, all change. Change is not always good, AOC, oh no. Okay, so, but Burke and Hamilton are interesting in that I think they get both revolutions right. They are pro-American Revolution and skeptical on the French Revolution. 2 for 2.
All right, so then we have a question about Liam, and he is concerned about divisions in the current society, polarizations. So he says, is there any evidence that perhaps the first true Americans at the founding of the country faced similar levels of divisions that we face today? And if there is evidence of that, can we learn from their experience to help us navigate our modern day divisions?
Yes. So this is exactly why I want you to read this book, because there are deep divisions. People fiercely opposed the Constitution, and yet they acquiesced in it and helped make it better with the Bill of Rights. And the civil war, the 1850s, are time that's going to be volume 2, deep political division, and out of that, we made lemonade called the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. We improved our Constitution. And in the aftermath, during a bloodbath of World War I, women get the vote. And in Vietnam, 18-year-olds get the vote, and we actually improve our system even as we're going through horrific experiences. Wow, that's interesting. Out of a revolution in which a lot of people die, we get a constitution that really is better than what we had before. That's interesting to me. And lots of Americans oppose the Constitution, you see. Lots of Americans oppose the American Revolution, and I try to tell a story about the most admirable of them, because they weren't all evil. I tell a story about the loyalists in America who supported the king, and they were good and decent people, many of them, and I want you to see their stories. They were the losers, but that doesn't mean that there's nothing to be said for them. So I introduced the reader to a man named Thomas Hutchinson, who was a decent person. He was a traditionalist. He believed in hierarchy, and he was kind of a company man. In the end, sided with his king against his hometown. He loved them both. If he had lived 20 years earlier, he wouldn't have had to pick between them. If he were alive today, he was a really smart guy, and I think a decent person. If he lived today, he'd basically be Mitt Romney, kind of traditionalist, but not a bad person at all. And the mobs treated him horribly. They destroyed his home. It was very bad. I'm writing about all this as BLM is exploding, and there's rioting on the left and there's rioting on the right in America. And so I'm trying to say, gee, actually, even people who were opposed to the American Revolution, they weren't all bad and evil people. And the people opposed the Constitution, they actually had a point. So yes, this book is about the deep debates in America and how at our best we've moved from those debates to try to achieve something that did not end in massive, that brought us together.
And then the next question, it has 2 parts, and I know you've touched on the Second Amendment a little bit, but So she is Susan, and she writes, there's a lot of confusion concerning the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms. Can you explain the intent of the founding fathers concerning this amendment? Do you think in the minds of the founding fathers, a well-regulated militia would be enough to
So,
address the amendment?
so I'm going on my share screen now. And if you just want a very quick version of this, just put in Akhil Amar, Second Amendment, Ezra Klein. Ezra Klein used to be with Vox. He's now, and the Washington Post now, he's with the New York Times. This is a history of the Second Amendment in 2 paintings. And there are longer versions of this. So if you just put in Akhil Amar Second Amendment, you'll find all sorts of free stuff to read. Here's what the Second Amendment means at the founding. This is the Battle of Bunker Hill. The original, this is in the Yale University Art Gallery, and it's the local militia against the British Redcoats, the bad guys. The heroes of this are sort of local rebels, okay? And that's what you guys in South Carolina seem to understand a bit, but this isn't the last word on it. So this is Luke Skywalker and Han Solo and a ragtag band of amateurs arrayed against an evil empire, okay? That's the original Second Amendment. It's military, it's political, it's localist, it's collective. Now, that all changes because, and our Constitution is the product of our history, and our history is the product of our wars, and the Revolutionary War, the localists, the good guys against the Imperial Center. And the Second Amendment reflects that. But that was all repudiated by the next constitutional war and the next set of amendments, the 14th Amendment. Now, let's see if I can make this a little small. So if you can see how this next picture is like the first one. There's, and this bottom one, which is the Freedmen's Bureau of 1866, there's a flag of the central government in the middle. And there's a guy in uniform in the middle. And there's, instead of one black person on the right corner, there's lots of black people on the right side. And instead of these militiamen, they've become Klansmen on the left. This is a totally different vision of arms bearing. Here's the idea of the first picture. When guns are outlawed, only the king's men will have guns, and we have to have local militias to push back against the central army. Here's the second vision. When guns are outlawed, only Klansmen will have guns. Blacks won't have guns in their homes to protect themselves against the Klansmen, and that's not a good idea. The second vision, the first vision was military. This is civilian. The uniforms are off. First vision is localist. This is nationalist. The flag of the central government. These are the good guys. This person in the middle is like Ulysses S. Grant. So we move from political, military, local to nationalistic, individual, communitarian is the founding, individualistic, nationalist, private, civilian. It's a different vision of guns in America. This is called the Freedmen's Bureau Act, and it's associated with the 14th Amendment, which says, actually, it's a companion statute to the 14th Amendment that everyone's allowed, even women, blacks, to have a gun in the home for self-protection. It's a totally different vision in America, and it's codified in the 14th Amendment. If you are a Christian, I happen to be, you don't have to be, but if you are, you read what we call the Old Testament through the prism of the New Testament, through the Gospels and the life, death, resurrection, and ministry of Jesus Christ. You read the book of Isaiah as if it says, a virgin shall give birth, rather than a young woman shall give birth. You know, you understand the personality of God not to be Yahweh, who is actually very scary, but Abba, Father. This is a different kind of personality because there was a reformist rabbi from Nazareth who reinterpreted these older texts. In the same way, what we call the Bill of Rights isn't really the first set of amendments. It doesn't even call itself the Bill of Rights. It's the first set of amendments as reinterpreted through the prism of the Civil War and the Reconstruction, which gives you a totally different vision of the world. And if you want a 2-minute version, look up Akhil Amar, Second Amendment, Ezra Klein, and you can just see a history of the Second Amendment in 2 paintings. If you want, that's a 2-minute version. If you want a 2-week version, read my book, The Bill of Rights, Creation and Reconstruction, which is part 1, Old Testament, part 2, New Testament.
The next question she had was about the First Amendment, allowing freedom of speech. Does the freedom include anything that is said, whether it is a lie or not? Does this freedom of speech include words that are harmful to people or can incite harm to people? I know it includes one's right to criticize our government and leaders. However, it appears it to be used to cover anything that pops out of one's mouth. Can you clarify this amendment also?
Yes, it doesn't say actually speech can't be abridged. It talks about not speech, but freedom of speech, and in particular, the freedom of speech, which is a system. And it's a system of political discourse. It's borrowed from the freedom of speech and debate in Parliament. And here's what it means in Parliament. If person A can get up and support the bill and give reasons, person B can get up and oppose the bill. From the French parler, to speak, Parliament is a place where people talk politically, and it's a place where actually all political opinions are allowed to be voiced. And in America, we, the people, are sovereign, not just the legislature. So we, the people, get to express political opinions, and government can't suppress political opinions, especially anti-governmental political opinions. But there is not in our tradition an absolute right to lie intentionally and without consequence. So libel laws do exist in America, but because some untruths might find their way into public discourse just accidentally, people exaggerate, they get their facts wrong. We don't want to chill robust political expression. So we have rules in place in a case called landmark case called New York Times versus Sullivan that say you can only really be punished in a civil lawsuit or criminally for intentional falsity rather than just for an accidental misstatement of fact. So there needs to be actual malice, an intentional falsehood or reckless indifference to the truth. And I can't give you a full seminar on free speech doctrine, but in a nutshell, there is not today an absolute right to intentionally lie with impunity. That's not what the freedom of speech is about quite. But we do protect broad political discourse, even if some people feel offended by that. Some people feel harmed by that. I'm a believer in the ability of people to express themselves. And if others take offense, they have to get used to it, because actually in America, people have to be allowed to express their political opinions forcibly. And you can then express your opinions on the other side, and you have to grow a bit of a tough skin. If I showed you right now on Twitter what has recently been said about me, it would be censored because they're actually expletives. And these are from people I never even met before. But I just have to get used to it, because that's what freedom means in America, is robust, uninhibited, wide open political discourse. Not, though, an intentional right to lie. But you can say harsh things that aren't lies. You can say, for example, that John Adams is an absolute buffoon and he's a narcissistic ass. You get to say, and shouldn't be reelected. You get to say that. People who said only that in 1800 got put in prison for 9 months. And that seems wrong to me.
Yeah. The next question is from Lily, and it's, if you could go back to the 1700s and change one thing in the Constitution, what would that be and why?
Yeah, so I don't have a magic one. We can't change history. I told you the one biggest mistake I think they made is they didn't phase out 3/5. They said, oh, you can import slaves South Carolina until 1808, and after that we can change it. They should have said for 1808, here are all the other things that change in 1808 or 1828 or 1858. We could, negotiate the numbers. But after a certain date, you shouldn't get extra credit for slaves. And after a certain date, there shouldn't be slavery in the West. And after a certain date, slavery itself should end. You got plenty of time to adjust to another line of business. So they should have put slavery itself. And after 1808, the North will no longer play fugitive slave catcher. And again, it doesn't have to be 1808, 1828, 1848, but they should have put all these pro-slavery things in the Constitution on a path of ultimate extinction. And if they had done that, maybe we would have avoided the Civil War. So that was their big mistake.
Okay. The next question is from Ian. I was wondering if there was significance in the order of the Bill of Rights.
Yes. And I've written about that in my book, The Bill of Rights, Creation and Reconstruction. I also, in this book, briefly tell you what the order was originally. The Bill of Rights, what we call the Bill of Rights, doesn't call itself the Bill of Rights, was originally going to be added to the original text of the Constitution. And so eventually it got added as separate postscripts and PPSs and PPSs. But originally the order was the order in which things were appeared in the original Constitution. So Congress shall make no law. That's Congress's powers, Article 1. Then there's some later amendments about a jury trial, for example. That's the judiciary. That's Article 3. There's still later stuff about global rules of interpretation that belongs at the end of the document. So originally, the order of the amendments tracked the order of the original text.
Okay. So the next question is from Isabel, which is, why is separation of power safer than concentration of power? What is an example of a framer's formula that could possibly help solve some of the really tough problems of today's society?
Well, not all democracies have American-style separation of powers, and some of them, may actually be better in certain respects. I think democracies are better than non-democracies, but I can't tell you that a parliamentary system is clearly inferior to an American separation of power system. In a parliamentary system, the head of the executive branch works very closely with and is a member of the legislative branch. And in America, the president is very separate from the House and the Senate. And in every state, the governor is very separate from the legislature. So that separation of power, we vote separately for the governor or the president than the legislature. And the idea is that if all the power were in one body, the prime minister and the parliament as one collective, even if they just barely won in an election and they didn't really have a mandate, they'd go to town and change all the rules immediately in possibly radical ways. Whereas a thought is in a separation of power system, the way we set it up, you typically have to win several elections in various ways before your policies prevail. 2 years for the House, 4 years for the presidency, 6 years for a staggered Senate, and that's a kind of buffering in the system. That's one thought.
Okay, so I'm going to skip down because I see that we have some questions in the chat, and I'm going to skip to one that I think we've kind of addressed the other. Well, you've kind of addressed the other ones in different talks, but in different responses. But Hannah asked, how far does the argument of personal liberty get someone when an issue is viewed as a national concern? How much can the government control things when it comes to the personal well-being of an individual before it becomes unconstitutional? Are there any clear lines?
Yeah, that's such a big question involving so much. So I can't say 0.72 is the answer. Okay.
Yeah.
So what I can tell you is that many rights have limits to them. For example, the Fourth Amendment doesn't say you have an inviolable right to be secure in your person, house, papers, effects against any and all intrusions. It says you have a right to be secure in your person, houses, papers, effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. And what's going to make something reasonable? So 20 years ago, they flew airplanes with bombs in them. They weaponized them and flew them. And because of that, we go through metal detectors and have to take off our shoes, and people can pat you down sometimes, and they didn't used to do that 25 years ago. Is that reasonable? I tend to think it is, because they do it to everyone, not just to people of color, people who look like me. It's relatively unintrusive. It's relatively non-discriminatory. There are reasons for it. They don't have men patting down women, so it's not a gender oppressive. So that's an example. We didn't do it before because we didn't have international terrorism to the same extent. Now we have more intrusive search and seizure policies because we have a real threat. So that's an example.
Okay.
So yes, one of your participants gave the example of Jacobson versus Massachusetts and vaccinations. Vaccinations can be mandatory for communicable diseases. They're not protecting me just, against myself, and maybe I get to decide for myself. They're protecting me because I'm a germ machine, and I don't maybe mean to do it, but I'm spewing germs. And exhaling and putting other people at risk. And so that's why vaccine laws, as a general proposition, are constitutional. And the Supreme Court will say that. And if you disagree with me, please email me offline. Let's bet a lot of money. I will give you even odds, a lot of money, tens of thousands of dollars. I'm happy to do that. Okay. Otherwise, please, I know you have strong opinions, but do you really know what you're talking about? Not all of you, truth be told. Okay, so the Supreme Court is going to uphold vaccine mandates of a certain sort, maybe even mask mandates that are genuinely, and here's the test, are they backed by real science? What does the FDA say? What does the CDC say? Because I promise you, in the court itself, today, they won't let the public in, and they will only let attorneys in who are vaccinated and masked. That's the rule for the court itself today. And if those are the rules for the justices, they're not going to say, oh, but other people can't have those rules either.
Yeah, I see a question from, I'm trying to scroll up a little bit, but I see Andrew, Kathy. And if you wanted, it says if we were, okay, hold on a second. Let me scroll. I'm sorry. There's been a couple. Okay, it says in America, if a pregnant woman is murdered, is the criminal charge with 1 or 2 counts of homicide? Constitutionally, at what time does a human being have their inherent rights within the United States?
I am pro-choice, and I believe that the intentional killing of a fetus could be treated as murder by and if you let's imagine it's a wanted pregnancy. You see, women, they have a right, even if you think that they should be able to end a pregnancy, they also have a right to have a child that they want. And some thug who is either the biological father or thinks that he's not the biological father, who shoots into the belly of a pregnant woman and injures her and kills the fetus, that's a legislature, I would say, is permitted to say there are 2 victims there. That doesn't necessarily decide the abortion question, which is about a fetus's rights against the mother in which the fetus is encased. And that's a different set of issues than a third party, you see. If you want to hear me talk about that more, I have a podcast. It's weekly, it's free. It's called America's Constitution. You can access it at akhilamar.com. And when the great Nadine Strawson, president of the ACLU for 20 years, came on our podcast, we talked about this. I've had Bob Woodward on my podcast and Alan Dershowitz. We've had Anil Katyal, lots of really interesting folks. We're having the great Gordon Wood, America's preeminent historian, just came out with a new book. We're interviewing him in a week or so. So I do believe a legislature could treat feticide as akin to murder. Yes.
Okay, I see several questions about the Electoral College and any changes you would suggest or problems and issues you see with it.
Yeah, so I do think the Electoral College was originally mostly about slavery, because in a direct election system, the South would lose every time because it doesn't let slaves vote. And I've argued that in various places. And we pick governors, 1 person, 1 vote. If that's a good way of picking governors, I think it could be a good way of picking presidents. Remember, I say, look at what states do. States pick their governors without an electoral college system. The stories that most people are told about the Electoral College, that it's about small states versus big states, that's actually not true. We've only had 4 small state presidents in all of American history. Biden, Clinton, Franklin Pierce and Zachary Taylor. So they say, oh, the framers didn't trust ordinary people. Yeah, they did. They put the Constitution to a vote and they created a directly elected House of Representatives. So that's not why and the Electoral College are not the smart people who are exercising independent judgment, never have been. So the original Electoral College was about slavery largely. I think I like the idea of one person, one vote. It promotes one equality, as I said. That, but if we stick with the Electoral College today, it wouldn't be the end of the world. The best argument for it is it's the system you know. Anytime you change it, there are possibly unintended consequences. Some of you may have heard of the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. It's a way of getting direct election of the president without a constitutional amendment. I invented that. I'm one of the two co-inventors of that. I remember when I was in my bathtub, and had this eureka moment. That said, I'm not so sure it's a good idea. I think it's a little screwy, truth be told. And I'm telling you that as the guy who actually invented the concept. I just thought it was an interesting idea, but I'm not sure it's actually, there are unintended consequences. I'm trying to be very candid with my fellow Americans here. So if you're for the Electoral College, here's the reason you should be for it. It's the system we have, could be worse. You change it, we could have all sorts of unintended consequences. If you don't like it, I think you say, oh, it has tainted roots. Okay, but what about today? You say, I actually believe in equality. One person, one vote. That's the way we pick a governor in South Carolina, a governor in Texas, a governor in California. That's how we should pick our president for the governor of us all. Those are the best arguments on each side.
Okay, I see Diane asked, you mentioned Justice Scalia. He was considered an originalist. What does that mean? Does being an originalist go against the Constitution as a living document?
So I've only got 6 minutes left, unfortunately, and my apologies because I've had such a great time. And if you wanted me to come back, yes, you know what you have to do? You have to invite me. I'll do it. Okay. But I've got another thing. There's a debate actually about packing the court that I agreed to do. I'm against the idea of packing the court. There are some Democrats who are in favor of it. I think kooky, folks on the far left. I'm opposed to it, but I do think you could have an idea of 18-year terms of service for the justices, and that wouldn't be so screwy. But I have to leave soon about that. So my apologies. Now, the question that I just got asked, I changed the subject to court packing, but what was the other question again, Jamie?
It was about being an originalist.
Originalist and Scalia. So to be an originalist means to take history very seriously, the original intent of the Constitution. I don't think that's an inherently conservative idea. The greatest originalist, I think, of the 20th century was not Antonin Scalia, but a great crusading Southerner, great from the Southland, Hugo Lafayette Black from Alabama, and he carried the Constitution around with him wherever he went. What a weird person would do that, to always carry a copy of the Constitution around with him. And so he was like Martin Luther, sola scriptura. We should pay attention to this, okay? Because people died for it. And he was a liberal crusader, the heart and soul of the Warren Court. He said, it says free speech. Let's do that. It says right to vote. Let's take that seriously. Oh, it says the Bill of Rights should apply against the states, basically. No state shall make or enforce any law which will abridge privileges and abuse fundamental rights of citizens. Yes, what if we took that seriously? It says that there should be religious equality. So why do we have prayer in the public schools where some people put their prayer and force other people to in government policy and force other people to pray it? So originalism means to take seriously not just the words but the historical background, the original meaning of, I would say, not just the Philadelphia Constitution but all the amendments. Scalia said he was an originalist, but he didn't know enough history, truth be told. And he didn't take seriously the history of the amendments which have made us more free and equal. You have to pay as much attention to the Reconstruction, to the women's suffrage amendment, to things in the 20th century. And I don't think he did that enough. Truth be told, he didn't love history. That wasn't his real love. He liked words. He liked to play around with words. But if you're a real originalist, you believe not just in words, but in the history behind them. And I think there are reasons to be originalist because people died for these things, and we want to know why they did them. Even if you're not bound by them, don't you want to know about how the world actually, what the hinge of human history actually was, what changed the world, even if you're not bound by it? If you want to, and you shouldn't think about amendments before you actually know why we have what we have. In Britain, the definition of a gentleman, my wife and I have been watching, we are way behind in the times, but we're only now binge watching Downton Abbey, and The Crown and all that stuff like that. But the definition of a gentleman in Britain is someone who never insults another unintentionally. There's a little pause there. Maybe that's the South Carolinian too. A Southern gentleman doesn't insult another unintentionally. So when you're calling someone out, okay? That's what it means to be a gentleman. But I don't think we should amend things unintentionally. We should amend them only after we studied why we have them in the first place, what problems people thought they were solving, and only then are we going to be in a position to decide whether we like that idea, whether the world has changed, whether we want to amend the thing, or whether we want to say, oh, actually, we should enforce that even more vigorously. Gandhi was once asked what he thought of Western civilization, Mahatma Gandhi. He paused and smiled. He had a great sense of humor. He said, so he's asked, what do you think of Western civilization? He says, I think it would be a good idea. And that's how I feel about a lot of things in the Constitution. I think they would be good ideas. Let's actually study them. And that's what we've been doing together. And I'm so very grateful that you've given me this opportunity to talk with you about that today.
Well, we are so immensely grateful to you, and I have truly enjoyed this, and I hope you who have been watching have enjoyed this as well. And I thank you, Dr. Amar, and we would love to have you back sometime. I see that I see a lot of students really interested in questions. I'm even receiving some on my phone through email, so I think you've really got them thinking. So I really appreciate it. I thank everyone for coming.